Take the gas station, Nell. It suits you. Nobody's needed it in years. That was the last thing my husband ever said to me as a married man. He said it quietly, almost gently, the way you'd tell a child the family dog had gone to live on a farm. We were standing in a glass conference room on the 14th floor of a tower he had built, and the carpet still smelled like the inside of a new car, and 14 floors down the city of St. Louis was going about its Tuesday as if nothing in my life were ending. His attorney slid a single page across the table. My attorney, the one I was paying by the hour and could no longer afford, gave me the smallest nod, so I signed. I signed my name 11 times that afternoon. By the last page, it had stopped looking like mine. The page was an asset schedule. Preston kept the house in Ladue, the one with the slate roof and the heated driveway. He kept the cars, the brokerage accounts, the retirement funds, his interest in Sutton Ridge Partners, and a quiet little family trust I had helped him set up years before, without understanding that one day it would be the wall between me and everything we had built. I kept my clothes. I kept my mother's wedding ring, which he had never liked, and I kept the real property listed at the bottom in small gray type, a closed filling station on Old Route 9 at Mercer Gap in Calder County, 4.5 hours southwest, in the part of the Ozarks where the cell signal dies and the road starts to climb. His lawyers had appraised it at $9,000. They handed it over without a single argument, the way you'd hand someone a coat you were glad to be rid of. My name is Nell Calloway. Everyone who matters has always called me Nell. That afternoon, I was 58 years old, with $416 to my name, and a bank account that in 90 days would have no name on it but mine. And I had just been informed, in the gentlest voice you can imagine, that I was something the world had quit having any use for. What Preston did not know, standing there in his good suit with his good watch, was that the worthless little station he had just slid across the table sat on the only piece of ground his life's biggest project could not survive without. His lawyers, at $900 an hour, had read the appraisal. They had not read the deed. By the time anyone in that building understood the difference, it would already be far too late for all of them. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start where it actually started, which was in a place I had spent 30 years pretending I'd forgotten. Before I tell you what I found behind that station, do something for me. Drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from. And tell me one more thing while you're there. Has anyone in your life ever made you feel like you stopped being needed? Because that word, needed, is going to matter more than you think. I read every single comment. Now let me take you to the mountain. I grew up half in a suburb and half in a gas station. My mother raised me in town, but every June she would drive me 4.5 hours into the hills and drop me at my father's station, and every August she would come and take me home, and the two of me that came back were never quite the same girl. My father was Walter Calloway. Everyone called him Walt. He ran Calloway's Garage and Fuel on Route 9 at the top of Mercer Gap for 44 years, and he died 9 years ago of a stroke in the apartment above the repair bay, alone, with the radio on. The station was 2 gas pumps and a cinderblock building and a 2-bay garage my father poured the concrete for himself in 1971. I learned to make change there before I learned long division. I learned to put my ear close to a running motor and name the part that was failing before anyone thought to lift the hood. By the time I was 11, I could read a tire the way other children read picture books, and I could do something my father prized even more than that, something he said mattered in any business and most marriages. I could keep a clean set of books. Walt kept a green cloth-bound ledger under the counter, and on slow afternoons he'd let me total the columns, and if I was off by even a dime, he'd make me find it. "A dollar you can't account for," he used to say, "is a dollar that's lying to you." I didn't know it then, but he was handing me the only weapon I would ever really need. I met Preston Sutton when I was 26. He was charming and certain and clearly headed somewhere, and in the beginning, he was delighted by the contradiction of me, a young woman who could set the gap on a set of points with one hand and balance a ledger with the other. We married a year later. For a while, he liked to bring it up at dinners, his wife who could pull a transmission in the morning and square a closing statement by dark. Then, somewhere in our second decade together, the story stopped coming out of his mouth. He never once asked me to put that woman away. He simply quit turning his head to look at her, and anything that goes unwatched long enough will fold itself back into the dark without being told to. Here is the part I am not proud of. When Preston started Sutton Ridge Partners, I closed the small bookkeeping practice I'd been quietly building and I went to work for him for free. Not as a partner, not as an employee with a title or a paycheck, as Preston's wife who helps out. For 31 years, I kept the firm's books and built its closing binders and read its title work because Preston could charm a banker out of his shoes but could not, on his life, tell you whether a chain of title was clean. I caught the errors. I flagged the easements. I knew where every dollar in that company slept at night. And the whole time, the city assumed I was a developer's wife who arranged the flowers at the ribbon cuttings. This is the story of what happens when the person you've decided is invisible turns out to have been watching the whole time. I want to be fair to the man, because the truth is more useful than the grudge. Preston was not a monster. He was something quieter and more common. He was a man who could put a price on anything and had never once in his life understood the difference between a price and a worth. And for 31 years, the thing he priced lowest was me. Let me give you the receipt, because I kept it the way my father taught me to. In 1998, the year my father had his first health scare, I asked Preston if we could drive down to the Gap together for a long weekend. He said the timing was impossible. He had a closing. We never went. The closing was for a strip mall that's a vape shop and a payday lender now. In 2006, our daughter Hannah graduated from high school, and 3 weeks later, my father called to say the bank was threatening the station over a tax matter, and I drove down alone with a cashier's check and fixed it alone. And when I got home, Preston asked, without looking up from his phone, "Is the old man finally going to sell that pile of rust?" In 2011, my father began carving a little wooden fox he meant to give me, and he kept it by the radio where he could pick at it between customers. And he never did finish it, because that was the fall his second stroke took the steadiness out of his right hand. In 2013, my father said one careful sentence to me on the phone. "Nell, a man who's proud of you doesn't make you the punchline." And I defended Preston. I told my own father he didn't understand, that it was just how Preston joked, that I was being sensitive. My father got quiet, the way he did when he decided not to win an argument he was right about, and said, "All right." It's the only time I ever took a side against my father, and I took the wrong one, and it sat between us unfinished until the morning the radio was playing in that apartment and he wasn't strong enough to answer the phone. In 2015, my father died, and I drove down for the funeral, and I stood in that station for 3 days, sorting through 44 years of a man's life. And Preston came for the service and left the same evening because he had, he said, a dinner. A national retailer's site selection team. He told me it could be company making. Sandayin Shasta Azur Mind Shi and I. I told him I understood. I always told him I understood. I locked the station door behind me, and I drove home, and I did not go back for 9 years. And every year at our anniversary dinner, in front of whatever clients or partners we were performing for, Preston would do the same bit. He'd lift his glass and he'd say, "And to Nell, who keeps all the receipts. That's her gift. She's the family filing cabinet. Nai arstisan char my nina minshide." Everyone would laugh. I would laugh. 31 years is a long time to laugh at a joke that is slowly erasing you. The lie I rationalized was the worst part, and it took me too long to even see it. About 2 years before the end, I started noticing charges on a firm card I reconciled every month, a furnished apartment downtown. Restaurants I'd never been to, always for two. A standing florist order on the 14th of every month, delivered to an address that was not mine. Her name, when I finally let myself look, was Brooke Ainsley. She ran acquisitions for the firm. She was 36. I told myself it was a client. I am very good at numbers, and I told myself it was a client because the alternative meant my whole life was a column that no longer balanced, and I was not ready to find the missing dollar. So when he filed, I didn't fight. I was too tired and too ashamed and too broke after a lifetime of building his wealth to afford the kind of lawyer who could have. I let him keep the things with prices on them. And he let me keep the one thing he'd decided had no price at all. There was a moment, in the last week of the divorce, that I didn't understand until much later. I was packing files at the firm, the way I'd packed files there for 31 years, and I found a memo I had not written. It was a one-page internal note, marked confidential, and most of it was numbers I'd have understood in my sleep on any other week. But one line near the bottom snagged on something in me. Even then, it read, Mercer Gap Corridor, Calloway parcel to be secured post-decree. Carrying value immaterial. Do not list as project critical. Semamang, Sawazanamang Manjre sign. I read it twice. My father's land. Project critical. And then Hannah called crying about the house, and Preston's lawyer needed me in the conference room, and I folded the memo into my coat pocket the way you pocket a receipt you mean to look at later, and I forgot it for exactly as long as a person can forget something that is going to change their life. I drove to the Gap to sell the station. That is the truth, and I'll say it plainly so you don't make me out to be braver than I was. I did not drive 4.5 hours into the hills to reclaim my power. I drove there because I had $416 and nowhere else on earth to go, and even $9,000 for a teardown was $9,000 more than I had. The interstate gave way to a state highway, the state highway to a county road, the county road to Route 9, a ribbon of cracked blacktop that climbs through oak and hickory into the high country where the towns thin out and then stop. It was early October. The leaves had only just started to turn, copper beginning to bleed into the green at the edges. I rolled the window down a few inches as the grade steepened, and the air that came in smelled of wet stone and wood smoke and something older underneath the both of them, and a part of my chest I'd kept padlocked for 9 years gave a little and began to ache. Then the road bent around a granite shoulder, and there it was, Calloway's Garage and Fuel, smaller than I remembered, the way everything from childhood is. The pump stood locked and rust-streaked under a sagging canopy. The little number wheels stopped on prices that hadn't been real in 20 years. A wild grapevine had pulled half the porch railing down and was working its way onto the roof. My father's hand-painted sign above the door had faded to the ghosts of letters. A crack ran corner to corner across a front window, and someone had taped it over long ago, with duct tape gone brittle and yellow, but the walls were square. The door, when I tried the handle, wouldn't give. The ring of keys was in the manila courthouse envelope, and the second one turned with a gritty complaint, and I stepped inside, and the past closed over my head like water. The air was thick and still and gold with dust in the late light. The long wooden counter still stood against the back wall, its top worn dark and smooth by 44 years of elbows and coins and keys set down. And on it, set out just as he'd left them the last morning he had the strength to come down the stairs, sat 3 things. My father's old transistor radio, his jackknife folded, and the little half-carved fox, the one he'd started for me in 2011 and never finished, its body smooth on one side and still rough wood on the other. I picked up the radio. The dial was set where it had always been, the AM farm and weather station out of Springfield, the one Walt swore by and the one I'd fallen asleep to 100 summer nights as a girl. I clicked the switch out of pure habit, expecting nothing, and after a moment of crackle, a man's flat voice told me the overnight low and the price of feeder cattle, and I had to put my hand flat on the counter to keep standing. I did not cry. I want you to know that. I'd done my crying months earlier, alone in a guest room while Preston slept down the hall behind a locked door. What I felt standing in my father's station was not grief. It was quieter and emptier than grief. It was the particular hollowness of a person who has been told, very politely, over and over, for a very long time, that she is not needed. And I had finally driven all the way to the one place on earth that agreed with him. I'd brought a thermos and a sleeping bag because I couldn't afford a motel. I climbed the narrow stairs to the apartment, and it was cramped and dim and intact. A bare mattress, a 2-burner stove, a refrigerator that hummed back to life when I plugged it in. I lay down in my clothes. There was one small window over the head of the bed, and through it I could see Route 9 dropping away into the dark, and past it the ridgelines stacked one behind the next in blue and gray, and more stars than I had seen in 30 years of living under a city's worth of light. And I made a plan that was barely a plan. In the morning, I would call whatever real estate agent would answer the phone for a place like this, and I would take whatever they offered, and I would start whatever came after 58 and broke and discarded. That was the plan when I fell asleep. By noon the next day, it would be gone, and something with teeth would be growing in its place. I woke to birdsong and the smell of dust and old coffee, and I went downstairs to begin saying goodbye to the place. That was when the first truck came up the mountain. It was an old Chevy, and the man who climbed out of it was easily 80, lean and slow, wearing a flannel shirt and a feed store cap from a place I doubted was still in business. He stood in the gravel apron looking at the building with his hands on his hips, and when I stepped out onto the porch, he turned, and his whole face changed. "Well, I'll be," he said. "You'd be Walt's girl." His name was Carl Pruitt, and he and my father had played cards on Thursday nights for 30 years. He didn't offer me sympathy, and he didn't ask why I'd come. He stood there a while, taking in the taped window and the collapsed railing, and the first thing he said to me was, "You eaten?" And when I admitted I hadn't, he said, "Opal'll fix that," and that is how I met the rest of them. Opal Cruz ran the diner down in Bell Hollow, 4 miles below the Gap, and had for the better part of 50 years. By the time Carl drove me down, word had already moved through the valley the way weather does, faster than anyone could have phoned it ahead. A woman I had never met set a plate in front of me and squeezed my shoulder and said, "Welcome home, Walt's daughter," and went back to the griddle before I could ask how she knew my name or why her eyes were wet. An old man at the counter told me my father had kept his truck running through 3 winters he couldn't have paid for, and never once handed him a bill. A younger woman said Walt had quietly covered her family's heating oil the year her husband left, and she'd only found out because the oil man let it slip. I sat in that diner and listened to a dozen people describe a man I'd believed I knew down to the ground, and bit by bit it came over me that I hadn't really known him at all. My father had done far more than pump gas on a forgotten road for 44 years, one unbilled favor at a time, without ever once saying so out loud. He had quietly held this entire valley up on his own, and he'd carried that all the way to his grave. His own daughter among the people he never thought to tell. I drove back up the mountain that afternoon, still meaning to sell, and I started cleaning the station, the way anyone tidies a place before putting it on the market. And because my hands needed a job that wasn't dialing a real estate office, I swept. I washed the windows with vinegar and old newspaper until the wood grain came up through 40 years of grime. And it was while I was wiping down the inside of the dead chest freezer in the stockroom, the one that hadn't run in a decade, that my hand found something my father had hidden in the one place no thief and no curious child would ever think to look in a building with no power. A leather book, thick and soft and held shut with a perished rubber band. A cigar box. And, tucked beneath them, a single sealed envelope with one word on the front in my father's careful block letters. Nell. I sat down on the cold concrete floor with my back against the freezer and opened the book first, and I read until the light went out of the windows. It was a ledger. But it wasn't a record of debts. It was a record of needs. Every loan my father had ever made and never asked back. Every repair he'd done and never charged for. Every sack of groceries he'd set quietly in the bed of a pickup while its owner's back was turned. Page after page, year after year, all in that same careful, slanting hand. He wrote down the births and the layoffs and the roofs he doubted would hold through to spring. The handful of people who paid him back he noted. The hundreds who never could, he simply let go without a mark against them. The cigar box was full of thank you notes, folded small, written on the backs of receipts and torn out notebook pages, from people whose lives my father had caught in his hands without ever once letting them see him do it. And then, near the back, in handwriting that had begun to shake, I found my own name. Nell rang the shop tonight. Didn't say much, but I could hear it in the spaces between the words. That man of hers is throwing money around again, the way a person does when he's outrunning something, and I'd put my last dollar on her being the one quietly squaring his accounts and holding his secrets and telling herself the whole arrangement is fine. She used to come straight at a thing. Now she circles it. I'd give a great deal to have her back up this mountain at this counter, so I could teach her to read a plat map all over again and pour her coffee strong enough to float a horseshoe. But she won't come. Not yet. Maybe never. All I want is for her to know the door stays open and the key hangs where it always has. Every child ought to be sure that somewhere in this world there's still one place that wants her in it. I read that last line 3 times. There still needs her in it. That is the only time in this whole story that I cried, and it was 1 tear, and I let it fall on the concrete, and I did not wipe my eyes after. I had driven to the one place that I thought agreed I was not needed, and my dead father had been waiting 9 years in a freezer to tell me it was the one place that did. I did not open the sealed envelope that night. I wasn't ready. I closed the ledger and pressed it to my chest, and I sat in the dark, and sometime between that final entry and the first star coming out over the ridge, the plan I'd made the night before quietly died, and I did not mourn it. I was not going to sell my father's station. I didn't yet know what I was going to do instead. But I knew it was not that. If you want to know what was in the steel box my father welded into the base of that air compressor, and why it was about to cost Preston Sutton $430 million, make sure you've hit subscribe right now. Because what comes next is the part he never, ever saw coming. The boy showed up 3 days later, and I almost didn't let him stay. His truck came laboring up the grade, a thin plume of steam working out from under the hood, and coasted to a dead stop a little way past the pumps. He was maybe 22, lean and sunburned, with grease worked so deep into the creases of his hands it had become a part of them. He raised the hood and stood there studying the engine, the way some people study scripture, and when I came over and said, "Upper radiator hose," he glanced up, startled that I'd know, and then went embarrassed, the way a person does once he's learned that help always arrives with a price he can't cover. "I've got a spare," he said. "No tools, though. And not much for bay time. Danans titanain ars makinanane." I didn't say a word about money, I told him. "Bring it into the bay." His name was Eli Marsh. He had the hose off in 6 minutes flat, and I found a close enough replacement in my father's stock and watched the boy's quick, certain hands and felt, for the first time in years, like I was watching someone be exactly who he was. He told me almost nothing about himself, but I'd kept Preston's books long enough to read a balance sheet in a young man's face. No family money, no soft landing anywhere. He was sleeping in that truck, and the last 3 places that had given him a chance had taken it back. What I didn't know yet, what I'd learn a week later from the ledger, was that 12 years before, my father had quietly paid $2,140 in back property taxes to keep a house in Bell Hollow from being sold out from under an old woman named Dot Marsh, Eli's grandmother. The boy bleeding the air out of my father's compressor lines was breathing the air of a roof my father had saved, and neither of us knew it yet. But I knew talent, and I knew loneliness, and I knew what my father would have done. "I'm reopening the station," I told him, and the words were out before I'd decided they were true. I could use a hand that knows its way around an engine and isn't scared of a keyboard. He gave me neither a yes nor a no. He topped off the coolant, stood listening until the idle smoothed out, dragged a shop rag off my father's bench to clean his hands, and said only that he'd think on it. The next morning at 7, he was back, and I had the coffee made. He gave the place a week, the way you test a board before you trust your weight to it, and at the end of that week he simply stopped mentioning the road, and I knew better than to make him say the rest out loud. It was Eli who found the box. We were servicing the old air compressor, because a station needs air before it needs almost anything else, and he was down on the floor working at its base when he went very still and said, "Miss Nell, this thing's been welded shut and it ain't part of the compressor." My father had cut a steel box into the cast iron base and welded a plate over it, and it took Eli 20 minutes with a grinder to open it. Inside, sealed in plastic against 40 years of damp, were documents, and tucked in the rafters of the bay above it, wrapped in oilcloth, was a leather map tube. I spread it all out on the workbench under the bay lights, and my 31 years of reading deeds for a living went to work, and the floor seemed to tilt very slowly under me as I understood what I was looking at. There was the original deed to the station and the acre it sat on, passed from my grandfather to my father in 1968. But there was more. Over the decades, in small transactions I'd never known about, my father had quietly bought up the 3 narrow strips of land that ran along the base of the ridge on either side of the gap. Not good for anything. Too steep to farm, too narrow to build on. He'd bought them, the ledger explained in a note, so nobody could ever fence the valley off from the road, or the road off from the valley. Manchan Samarsana Manshir, Manchanastai. And in the map tube was a survey, professionally drawn, properly recorded, dated 35 years ago, establishing a perpetual recorded easement across all of it. It took me most of the night to let myself believe what it meant. Mercer Gap is a notch in the ridge. It is, quite literally, the only place for 11 miles in either direction where a road can climb from the lowland onto the high plateau without an act of God and $100 million of cut and fill. And every foot of that notch, the parcel and the strips and the recorded right-of-way across them, belonged to me. Free, clear, and clean as spring water. Separate property, inherited, never marital, never touched by Preston's money or Preston's name. Mercer Gap Corridor, the memo in my coat pocket had said. Calloway parcel to be secured post-decree. Do not list as project critical. Syndicated one stein. Manchester one shine. I understood it all at once. The whole shape of it. The way you read a chess position a beat before your opponent does. Preston was building something enormous at the gap, and it needed a road up onto that plateau, and the only ground a road could cross was my father's. His own people had known it, written it down, marked it confidential, rather than buy it fairly or even mention it during the divorce. Preston had done the most Preston thing imaginable. He had instructed his lawyers to value it as a teardown, push it across the table to me, and then quietly buy it back from his broke, discarded ex-wife for pennies once the decree was signed. Carrying value immaterial. He had stripped me of the one thing he needed most by convincing me it was worthless, and he had been so certain I'd never figure it out that he put it in writing. I sat down on the milk crate in my father's bay, surrounded by tools, each one outlined in marker on the pegboard, and for the first time since the conference room, I was not tired. I was awake the way you're awake at the top of a long fall, all the way to the ends of my fingers. I did not call a lawyer in a rage. I did not call Preston at all. My father's voice was in my head, the thing he said when an engine came in that everyone else had given up on. Nah, don't yank on it. Find the one bolt that's holding the whole thing wrong and turn that one. So I made coffee, and I started, very quietly, to turn the bolt. This is the part that took the longest, and it is the part I'd want you to remember if you ever find yourself where I was. The temptation, when someone has wronged you, is to make noise. To call and scream, to post, to threaten. Noise is what the Prestons of the world are built to handle. They have lawyers for noise. What they cannot handle is a quiet, patient, perfectly documented person who has all the time in the world and nothing left to lose. So I gave them silence, and I gave them paper, and I let them keep believing they had won. First, I needed to understand the project before I touched anything. That's where Eli changed everything. The boy could not afford college, but he could pull a county recorder's database apart with his thumbs, and over 2 weeks at the counter on a second-hand laptop, with the radio playing the cattle prices, we built a map of what Preston was doing. It had a name. Gateway 9, an inland logistics hub, a sorting and distribution megacenter the size of 40 football fields, anchored by a national retailer's 20-year contract, fed by a brand-new interstate interchange. $430 million. Lead financing from a fund called Meridian Infrastructure Partners. Permits pending before the Calder County Planning Commission. A groundbreaking ceremony already scheduled, with press and dignitaries and the anchor tenant's executives flown in. And every public document Preston's firm had filed, every investor summary Eli could find, every word Preston had said to the county and the press, contained the same quiet, enormous lie. Site control complete. Access secured. The corridor, the filings implied, was a non-issue, a formality. It was not secured. It was mine. And he had told a fund and a Fortune 500 company and a county government that it wasn't. Second, I needed someone who knew the law better than I knew it, and the Valley, in its quiet way, provided. Opal mentioned over pie one evening that there was a retired attorney living down past Bell Hollow, a woman named Frances Aldridge, who'd practiced real estate and title law in Calder County for 40 years before she hung it up. She knew your daddy, Opal said, watching me carefully. Knew him real well. You ought to call her. Chatan. Frances Aldridge came up the mountain the following morning. She was in her 70s, tall and straight as a fence post, with a pair of reading glasses on a beaded chain and a scuffed leather case that had plainly sat through hearings in every courthouse in 3 counties. She walked into the bay, took one look at the documents laid out across my father's workbench, and went completely silent. Then she put on her glasses and picked up the recorded survey, and I noticed her hand wasn't altogether steady. I drew this, she said. 35 years ago. I was the lawyer your father hired to record it. He wanted it bulletproof. I told him no one would ever try to build through this gap, and he laughed and said, "Then we've wasted an afternoon, Francis, and that's the best kind of afternoon there is." She set it down and looked at me over the glasses. "Why am I really here, Eleanor?" So I told her. All of it. The marriage, the books I'd kept for nothing, the affair I'd ignored, the memo in my coat pocket, the $9,000 appraisal, the line in my father's ledger about the door being open. Frances listened without a single interruption, which is its own kind of mercy. When I finished, she took her glasses off and folded them in her lap and was quiet for a moment. "Your father," she said finally, "kept my family warm one winter I don't like to talk about. My husband had just died and left me more debt than sense, and I had 2 children and a bar exam in front of me, and one cold morning the heating oil tank was full and the man swore he didn't know who'd ordered it. I found out years later it was Walt. He never let me thank him. He said thanking him would make it a transaction, and it wasn't one." She put her glasses back on. "So you'll forgive me if I find I have some time on my hands for his daughter, free of charge. Now, let's talk about what your husband has actually done, because I promise you it is worse for him than you think." And it was. Frances walked me through it like a teacher who'd been waiting a long time for the right student. The land was unassailable, inherited separate property, never mixed into the marriage, never paid into with shared money. Preston had no claim to it. None. Full stop. But that, she said, was only the floor. Because Preston hadn't simply failed to acquire the corridor. He had affirmatively represented to a county government and to sophisticated investors and to a publicly traded anchor tenant that he controlled it when he knew from his own confidential memo that he did not. And he had concealed a material asset's true value in a court proceeding to strip it from me cheaply. "The first thing," Frances said, "is fraud on his investors and possibly his lender. The second thing is fraud on the divorce court. Either one is a noose. He has put both around his own neck and handed you the slack. Nasterbain jita my minds, nacha my mine. Third, and this is the piece Preston never imagined, I had the books. For 31 years, I had kept my own private set of green cloth-bound ledgers, the way my father taught me, and I had kept clean copies of every deal file I ever built in a banker's box I'd carried out of that firm in the last week with my houseplants and my coffee mug, because no one thought to stop the filing cabinet from taking a box. Inside, it was the internal valuation history of the Mercer Gap corridor going back years. Memos in Preston's own hand. An email chain where his acquisitions head, Brooke, wrote, "If we list the Calloway parcel as critical, the wife's lawyer flags it. Recommend we appraise the structure only and recover post-divorce." And Preston's one-line reply, which I would have framed if I were a crueler woman, agreed. "She'll never read past the first page. Can't read our..." I had read past the first page. I had read every page for 31 years. He just never noticed. The near miss came in early November. A white crew cab truck with a surveying company's logo pulled into the lot one gray morning. 2 young men in safety vests and a third in a barn coat who plainly didn't work outdoors. He called himself a site consultant for the Gateway project and asked very casually whether they might take a few readings out on the public right-of-way. I poured them coffee and played the part Preston had written for me, a tired woman in her late 50s running a gas and coffee stop on a forgotten road, no threat to anyone. I'd been underestimated my whole life, and that morning it served me. But the man in the barn coat was sharper than the boys. He walked the apron, looked up the notch toward the ridge, then down at a plat on his tablet, and frowned, and I watched him start the same arithmetic I'd done by lamplight 3 weeks before. "This grade's the only way up onto that plateau, isn't it?" he said. "Whose ground is all this?" My heart climbed into my throat, but I'd kept this man's secrets for 31 years. Keeping one of my own for an afternoon cost nothing. "County, I always assumed," I said, and topped off his coffee and asked whether his people were from around here, and he forgot the question, the way men forget what a harmless older woman asks them. They were gone within the hour. I watched the truck drop down Route 9 out of sight, then sat on the porch step and let my hands shake, Finally, in private, where it cost nothing. We worked through October and into November. Eli scanned every document into clean, organized files, building a timeline a child could follow. Frances drafted the legal architecture and made 2 careful phone calls, one to the county and one to someone she would only describe as a friend who works where investors complain. I rebuilt the station around the work because a quiet life is the best possible cover. I got the pumps inspected and a fuel contract signed. Carl rebuilt the porch railing. Opal sent food. The valley came back to the station the way water finds an old channel, people pulling in for fuel and staying an hour over the coffee pot, and without ever quite deciding to, I found myself keeping the place the way my father once had. The man with the screaming fan belt paid for the belt and nothing for Eli's labor. The young mother with the worried face and the near-dry tank drove off with a full one and a standing invitation to settle up whenever she came back through. It wasn't generosity. It was that I had to be needed somewhere, and nobody I ever met understood the gap between those 2 things the way my father did. Frances and I made one more decision together, sitting at the counter with the radio low and the clean folders between us, and it turned out to be the most important one. We did not send a lawyer's letter. We did not file in court and serve Preston quietly. Frances explained why, and the moment she did, it was obvious. If you sent him a letter, she said, he settles it in the dark. He buys your silence, or finds another way up that nobody's thought of, or just delays until your money runs out and mine does too. A private fight is a fight he can afford and you can't. She tapped the top folder. But in a few weeks, he's going to stand up in a field in front of the people whose money he's spending and tell them something that isn't true. The fund, the anchor tenant, the county, all in one tent, leaning on the same false sentence. You don't take that to a courtroom first. You take it to the room where the lie is being told, on the day he tells it, and you let the people he lied to hear it from his own mouth, and then hear the truth from yours. She closed the folder. Then it stops being your word against his. It becomes his word against his own memo. So we waited, and it was the hardest waiting of my life, harder than all the quiet years before it, because now I knew, and to know a thing and hold still is its own kind of work. My father had taught me the difference between reacting and choosing. For once, I chose. And once, near the end of it, Preston gave me exactly the chance my father's principles required me to give him, one last opportunity to come clean and be a decent man. He called. The first time in 2 months. His voice was warm, the closing voice, the one I'd heard him use on 1,000 bankers. He'd heard I was up at the old place, he said. He thought it was wonderful that I'd found a project. And then, gently, the pivot, the way water turns a bolt. Listen, Nell, between us, that property's a liability up there. The taxes, the environmental exposure on those old tanks. Let me take it off your hands. I'll have Gordon send paperwork. 40,000, more than fair for a teardown. Let me do this one nice thing for you. $40,000 for the corridor of a $430 million project. One last test, and he failed it without even slowing down. That's kind of you, Preston, I said, and I meant the words to land somewhere he couldn't see. I'll think about it. That's my girl, he said. You always did the smart thing. I hung up and looked at Frances, who had heard every word on speaker, and she said very dryly, well, he's still telling you what you are. Let's go, let everyone else hear it for once. The groundbreaking for Gateway 9 was held on a cold, bright morning in mid-November in a white tent pitched in a cleared field at the base of Mercer Gap, with a view straight up the notch to the ridge. My father's land. There was a podium and a banner and rows of folding chairs and a long table of catered food no one in that valley would have recognized. There were county commissioners and a state economic development official and a knot of regional press with cameras. There was Howard Lindqvist, the Meridian managing director who'd written the checks, and a delegation of executives from the anchor tenant flown in for the photographs. And there was Preston, in a navy overcoat, 62 and tanned and certain, Brooke at his elbow in a coat that cost more than the fuel contract I'd just signed, both performing the easy confidence of people who believe the day belongs to them. I parked my father's pickup at the edge of the field. the same truck I'd packed my life into the day I left Ladue, and I walked in with Francis Aldridge on one side and Eli Marsh on the other, the boy carrying a banker's box. I had dressed carefully. Not expensively, carefully. I wanted Preston to recognize me, and I wanted him to see that I was no longer the woman who signed where the arrow pointed. He saw me from the podium mid-sentence and missed a beat, the smallest stumble, and then recovered, because he always recovered. I took a seat in the back row. I did not make a scene. Making a scene is what they're ready for. I waited. Preston gave his speech. He thanked Meridian. He thanked the county. He talked about jobs and growth and a new chapter for Calder County, and he gestured up at the gap, at the very corridor he did not own, and he said the words into a live microphone in front of cameras and investors and a county government. Every piece is in place, he said. Site control is complete. There is nothing standing between this valley and 400 good jobs but a ceremonial shovel. Fringery Manschein Natch and Stree Crow. When the applause settled and the master of ceremonies asked, by rote, if anyone present had questions before the photographs, Frances Aldridge stood up. She is 73 years old, and she has a voice that has filled courtrooms, and she did not need the microphone. I have a question, she said. I am a retired member of the bar of this state. My name is Frances Aldridge, and I'd like to ask Mr. Sutton to clarify, on the record, what he means by site control is complete. You could feel the tent change. Howard Lindqvist of Meridian sat forward. The anchor tenant's lead executive, a sharp-eyed woman who'd flown in for a photo op and was now paying very close attention, turned in her seat. Preston smiled the smile and said something smooth about all material parcels being secured. That's interesting, Frances said, because the only road grade onto that plateau runs through Mercer Gap, and the parcel and the recorded access easement across the entirety of that gap are owned, free and clear, by my client, who inherited them from her father, and who has never sold, leased, or granted anything to anyone. She let that sit for exactly 1 second. My client is sitting in the back row. Perhaps Mr. Sutton would like to introduce her. They were married for 31 years. Every head in the tent turned. There were 31 people under that canvas that morning, investors and officials and press and the man I had married, one for every year I'd spent being his filing cabinet, though I hadn't arranged it that way and only counted it later. And I stood up. I want to tell you that I delivered a speech. I didn't. My father never trusted a man who needed a lot of words to say a true thing. I walked to the front, and Eli set the banker's box on the catering table, and Frances handed the county commission chair a folder, and handed Howard Lindqvist a folder, and handed the anchor tenant's executive a folder, each one containing the same clean, scanned, dated timeline. The recorded deed, the recorded easement, the survey, drawn 35 years ago, and then the page that ended it, Preston's own confidential memo. The email chain, Brooks' recommendation to appraise the structure only, and Preston's reply in his own words on firm letterhead, agreed. She'll never read past the first page. I watched it happen across their faces in sequence, the way Frances said it would. The commissioners' faces went careful. Lindqvist's went cold, the specific cold of a man calculating how much he'd just put at risk on a representation that wasn't true. And Preston, my husband of 31 years, did the 3 things Frances had promised me he would do in the exact order she'd promised. First, he bluffed. He laughed, a little too loud, and said this was a personal matter, a bitter ex-wife, that everything was completely in hand, that the easement question was a technicality our council resolved months ago. Then produce the instrument, Frances said pleasantly. I'll wait. I drew the only one that exists. Then he negotiated. The smile slipped and the closer came out, and he turned not to me but to Lindqvist, his voice dropping into the register he used for deals. Howard, this is exactly the kind of thing we button up in the next 30 days. I'll acquire the parcel personally, today if I have to. Name the price. And he turned to me at last, the way you finally look at a tool you need. Nell, whatever you want. 200,000. $500,000. You name it. Let's be reasonable adults. The tent had gone so quiet I could hear the banner snapping in the wind. The press had stopped pretending not to record. And then he denied, because Howard Lindqvist had stood up, holding the memo, and asked the only question that mattered, in front of everyone. Preston, did you know this corridor was project critical and represent to this fund that it was secured, when it was not? Someone she wanna mainstamrinir, menshaimanamainir. And Preston, cornered, looked at the page with his own signature on it and said, that document is being taken out of context. That was the moment it collapsed, and it collapsed all at once, the way a thing comes apart when the one wrong bolt finally turns. Lindqvist closed his folder and said, quietly enough that we all leaned in to hear it, Meridian is suspending all funding pending review. As of right now, the Acre tenant's executive was already on her phone, walking out of the tent. The county commission chair set the folder down on the podium like it was warm to the touch and announced that the planning matter was tabled indefinitely. Brooke had stepped back from Preston's elbow without seeming to decide to, putting a clear yard of cold November air between herself and the man she'd written that email with. And Preston Sutton stood alone in front of his own banner, in his good overcoat, and looked at me and asked the question I think he genuinely never asked himself in 31 years. I never once saw any of this in you, he said. In 31 years, not once. I thought about all the answers I could give. I thought about the receipts, all the years of them. I thought about the fox on the counter my father never finished, and the line in the ledger about the door being open, and a man who measured a place by who could count on it, married to a man who could only ever measure what he could sell. And I gave him the truth. Quietly, the way my father would have, in front of every witness in that tent. That's the truest thing you've said all day. You never looked. I was always this person, Preston. You just decided I was a filing cabinet, and you stopped reading me about the same time you stopped reading the deed. I let it settle. You told me, the day you handed me this place, that nobody had needed it in years. You were half right. Nobody needed it. You needed it. You needed it more than anything you've ever built, and you handed it to the one person on earth who'd actually read what was inside it, and you called it a parting gift. I picked up my father's banker's box from the table. Thank you for the gift, Preston. I accept. Nastumblon makshti in matcher my ear. I did not wait for an answer. I walked out of the tent and into the cold, and Eli walked beside me, and Frances behind us, and behind her the whole sound of a $430 million deal coming apart in real time. I drove back up the mountain. The word for where I was going came to me as the road began to climb, and I let it stay. Home. 8 months on, the dogwoods along Route 9 were turning gold for the second time since I'd come back, and the place had a pulse again. The pumps were busy from open to close. Eli took on the bulk of the repair work, and he was good at it. Fast and square and honest, and folks drove right past the newer shops in town to bring their trucks to a building with my father's name lit back up over the door. I'd found the breaker he had labeled himself in pencil, thrown it one cold evening, and stood out in the gravel watching Calloway's garage and fuel burn against the dark for the first time in 9 years. Not bright, not new, but lit. Preston's troubles did not stay quiet, the way troubles never do once the paper is out of your hands and into the world's. Gateway 9 died in the field where it broke ground. Meridian's review became a lawsuit. The Acre tenants' lawyers added their own. The securities people Frances had described as a friend who works where investors complain opened a file, and the last I heard, Preston and Sutton Ridge Partners were spending the firm's remaining money defending the representations he'd made into that live microphone. I take no joy in the details. I'll tell you honestly. My father never gloated over a busted engine. He just noted what had broken it, so the next one wouldn't. Preston broke himself on his certainty that I would never read past the first page. I simply stopped agreeing to be the woman he'd described. And here is the part I'm proudest of, the part that has nothing to do with him at all. I did not keep the corridor to sell to the highest bidder. I'm not a developer, and I never wanted to be one. I put the parcel and the strips and the easement into a trust, and I named it for my father, and the trust's only rule is the one he wrote in the ledger. Nobody can ever fence the valley off from the road, or the road off from the valley. There will be no mega center at Mercer Gap. There may someday be something smaller and the valley's own. The county's talking about a clinic now, on land I'd give them, because the nearest doctor is 50 minutes down the mountain, and my father would have had something to say about that. Frances drew the trust documents. She wouldn't take a fee for that either, so I keep her in pie from Opal's, which she says is a worse deal for her cardiologist and a better one for her soul. Hannah came up in the spring. My daughter had sided with her father during the divorce, and I'd let her, because the truth is hard to give a child about her own father, and I wasn't ready to be the one to break it. She sat in her car out in the gravel a while before she made herself come in. She had dressed like a woman visiting a place she'd written off in advance, and she stopped just over the threshold, taking in the clean windows and the stocked shelves and the radio murmuring on the counter and the sign burning through the glass, and the whole of it old and plain and unmistakably working. She looked around and said quietly, "This isn't what I drove up here to find, Mom." I asked her what she'd driven up expecting. She blinked hard and said, "Somewhere I could rescue you from." We sat behind the counter a long time, and I told her the truth at last, gently, all of it, and she took it the way you take something heavy when you've finally grown strong enough to carry it. She brought my granddaughter June the next visit. June is 7. I took her into the bay and lifted her up to see my father's tools, each one outlined in marker on the pegboard so you'd know if one ever went missing. I let her hold the flashlight while I showed her how to read a tire gauge. "You push it on here," I told her, "and the little number that pops out tells you whether there's enough air in the tire." She pressed it and read out 32 and looked up at me, and she had a grin I recognized from a photograph Carl Pruitt dug out of his garage and gave me, of a girl my age in overalls standing in front of these same pumps with her father's hand on her shoulder. The grin folded 50 years over on itself in a single second, and I had to set her down and turn away and pretend to look for a rag. Eli signed up for a diesel mechanic certification he takes online, sitting at the counter after closing with a laptop the station bought him, filling a spiral notebook with notes in a hand that, I'd swear on anything, has begun to lean the same way my father's did. When I said as much, he just shrugged and told me that neat writing is neat writing and let it go at that. He's got the spare room upstairs now and a real mattress instead of a truck seat, and last month he drove his grandmother Dot up the mountain to see the place, and I watched her stand in the bay where her grandson works and take in the building my father had quietly kept the roof over her head, and not one word of it needed explaining from me. The valley already knew. The valley always knows. Late one afternoon this past week, after I'd locked the pumps and sent Eli upstairs, I bought a ledger of my own, not a fancy one. A cloth-bound book, dark green, the kind they sell at the feed store in Bell Hollow, and I set it on the counter next to the cash drawer where my father kept his. Most of the pages are still blank, but the first name I wrote in it isn't a stranger's. There's a man named Royce Tilden who shows up in my father's old book 4 separate times across the 80s, always for the same thing, a partial on a propane fill, paid quiet, never collected. Royce is 86 now. He lives alone in a trailer off the county road with a tank that runs dry every February. And I know that because Opal knows it, the way Opal knows everything that happens in this valley before the people it's happening to. So last week, I called the propane company down in Bell Hollow and put $200 against his account and asked them, please not to say where it came from. The girl on the phone needed a name for their records anyway. I gave her my father's. Then I wrote it in my green book, the way he wrote his. The date. What was needed. Nothing at all about being paid back, because I understand now that being paid back was never once the point, and that it took me 58 years and the loss of everything with a price tag on it to finally hear what my father had been saying in that ledger the whole time. Here is what I know now, at 58, that I didn't know in that glass conference room. My father measured a place by who could count on it. Preston measured everything by what he could sell it for. I spent 31 years married to one number and a single childhood summer learning the other, and it took losing everything with a price on it to find out which number actually holds. Strength doesn't announce itself. It doesn't slap the table or raise its voice. It sits quiet in the dark, in a freezer on a mountain, keeping a clean and patient record until the day somebody finally needs it to be true. So let me ask you, the way I promised I would. Have you ever been handed a parting gift by someone who decided you weren't worth much? Have you ever had to drive all the way to the bottom of yourself before you found out what you were actually made of? Tell me in the comments. I read every one, and I want to hear your story because I promise you are not as alone on that road as they made you feel. And if this one stayed with you, subscribe and stay with us, because there's always another story, and there's always someone out there being underestimated right now who needs to hear it. I shut off the lights, the front room first, then the stock room, then the counter lamp. I picked up my father's jackknife and the little half-carved fox, and I sat for a while at the counter, and then I did something I'd been working up to for 8 months. I opened the knife, and I started, very carefully, to finish carving the rough side. I'm not as good as he was. I'll get better. The radio played the overnight low and the price of feeder cattle, the way it had every morning of my childhood, and through the front window the sign hung lit and faded and hand-painted against the coming night. I turned the front door key, the same one my father had worn smooth across 40 years, and locked up for the night. Upstairs, the apartment smelled the way it always smells now. Cold coffee, clean grease, a little wood smoke off the stove. The smell of a place that belongs to somebody who intends to stay. I am 58 years old. For 31 years, I was a name at the bottom of other people's pages, signing where the arrow pointed. I am nobody's parting gift now. There's an old story about my father in this valley, that he could diagnose an engine by sound alone, name what was wrong with it before he ever lifted the hood. I used to think that was his whole gift. I know better now. His gift was that he read people the same way he read engines, close and patient and without flinching, and he never once mistook what a thing was worth for what it would sell for. Preston never learned to read past the first page of anything. Not a deed, not a marriage, not me. It cost him $430 million, and the one thing in his life he was ever offered for free. The sign is lit. The door opens at 6. And anybody who drives to the top of this mountain expecting to find nothing left up here is welcome to come and see what's actually standing.